And it reads, in that day, there will be a highway from Egypt. And this is actually not about the Edomites. We're going to go into that in a second. So I set it up a little early, but just wanted to get that out there. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian will come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve the Assyrians. Now, Vocab, this is actually one when you and I were talking that you brought up to me. And so I'm going to let you kind of just set up because obviously one verse doesn't do justice to the whole situation. The only thing I do notice is obviously Egypt is in Africa, and, they end up serving.
Yeah. So I love this passage, and the context is absolutely astounding when you look at the context here of Isaiah 19. And Isaiah is such a full-orbed book. So you start out in the beginning of what's now chapter 19, and it says an oracle concerning Egypt, and it's judgment. And then you get to verse 16, and sometimes you'll see in the headings of some Bibles, Egypt, Assyria, Israel, blessed. And you're like, wait, what? And you're like, okay, what's going on? Wait, what's going on here? And it says in verse 18, in that day there will be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord of hosts. Now, there's a couple of things in there that make you scratch your head, but one is, wait, people in Egypt swearing allegiance to the Lord of hosts. Okay. Then you go on, look at this. In that day, this is verse 19, leading up to verse 23, of course, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. When they cry to the Lord because of oppressors, who's the one crying? The Egyptians.
Yeah.
It's talking about the Egyptians when they cry to the Lord because of oppressors. He will send them a savior and defender and deliver them. Now that's wild. And the Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, not Israelites living in Egypt, or not Israelites in an Egyptian state of mind. It says to the Egyptians. They live in Egypt. They're in cities of Egypt. And this is Egypt. And the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day. So this is a new development. They'll know the Lord in that day and worship with sacrifice and offering. And they will make vows to the Lord and perform them. And the Lord will strike Egypt, striking and healing. And they will return to the Lord, and he will listen to their pleas for mercy and heal them. Verse 23. In that day, there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, and Assyria will come into Egypt, and Egypt into Assyria, and the Egyptians will worship with the Assyrians. This is absolutely amazing. I'm going to read the next 2 verses here, but it's talking about a highway that extends from Egypt to Assyria, basically follows the Fertile Crescent. I believe it makes sense to see the highway as essentially symbolic of what? Of universal salvation, because it extends from west to east.
Yeah. And
really, is it just Assyria and Egypt here? I think this is saying in a shortened form, because Isaiah does this a lot. He'll mention one nation as representative of the nations. And it seems that it's almost certain when you take it in the context of all of Isaiah, that this is a way to say that the nations will join in the worship of the Lord. And they'll be known as the blessed Lord. Now, if someone doesn't like that and they want to stick with Egypt and Assyria, okay, it's still going to be a massive problem for one Westers. But let's mess around with that for a second, just looking at those now, okay? But let me tell you real quick why I say that other thing, which is this. 2 powerful empires of that day and throughout the history there would be Egypt and Assyria.
Right.
And so they're very emblematic of empires of the day and powerful peoples, right? And that's important. It's like them plus everybody else, you know what I'm saying? Plus the not as powerful. Isaiah does this a lot. He will make a graphic or detailed example to illustrate a general principle. If this is a common thing that interpreters of Isaiah catch on to. Graphic, detailed example to illustrate a larger point. And I believe that's what's happening here. But again, it's still a problem because the Egyptians, under One West understanding, are not Israelites. They don't flow on the chart. That people group does not. And the Assyrians don't either. Now, it is interesting in actual history, And people debate about this, but I just want to put it out there. In actual history, two people groups very early in the history of the church who very willingly and very openly and very full, kind of wholeheartedly, full-throated, if you will, came to the Lord in the days of the early church were the Egyptians and the Assyrians. And that's a fascinating thing because you think about Assyria, conquering the northern kingdom, and then of course you got Jonah going there.
Yeah.
You think about Egypt, this is very fascinating to think about these nations being mentioned.
Yeah.
And yet they are. And within the history of the Christian church, these are some of the sort of most Christian. For a long time, to be Egyptian meant to essentially be Christian. I'm not saying it literally means that. You're not a Christian just because you're in a geographical region. But that was the way that for the advent of invasion of the Arab Muslims, because Egyptians are not originally essentially an Arab people by and large, although there's a large mixture in Egypt. Anyways, before that, it was like, I'm Christian. The Assyrians, regardless of the issues with the Assyrian church specifically, the Assyrians, same thing, very similar. And so you look here, and I've known Assyrian and Egyptian Christians. They hold these verses very near and dear to their heart. They mean something really special to them, and it's a beautiful thing. And it's hard to talk about an Israel-only type book when you have this going on. I mean, come on. Yeah. These two nations were enemies in Isaiah's day, and yet they're worshiping together. Who are they worshiping? The God of Israel.
And not just enemies of each other, but of Israel.
Yes. In Isaiah's day, it's funny, Judah was hoping that Egypt would save her from Assyria. During Isaiah's time, Judah was putting its hope in Egypt to save her. From who? Assyria. And yet Isaiah says, those enemies and the historical enemies and people relying upon, they're all going to have a harmonious, peaceful relationship only under the hands of God's blessing. And this again fulfills the Abrahamic promise in Genesis 12:3. What's it say? In you, that's to Abraham, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now let's read this verse. I just want to make sure everyone hears it. Watch this. Verse 24. In that day, Israel will be the third with Egypt and Assyria. Again, showing it's not just talking about Israel, because it's there's a number there. And the third, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, now watch what he says, blessed be Egypt, my people. Yahweh calls Egypt his people here. That's crazy. and it's just dumb, frankly, to say this really means blessed be Israel, my people, and Israel, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Although, interestingly enough, you could see God saying something as far as those phrases by themselves. It wouldn't make sense if they're all three together, but you could see God saying that, hey, Israel, my people, Israel, the work of my hands, Israel, my hands, because he says stuff like that about Israel. And yet that's the point. Isaiah is purposely taking things that are usually used to describe Yahweh's relationship and feelings, to use a human term, towards his people, Israel, and using them for foreign nations. Egypt, my people. I love to ask you Israelites, hey, who are God's people? Who does God refer to as my people? They're always just saying Israelites. And I say, well, I thought it was the Egyptians. Look here. Who is the work of Yahweh's hands? What nation is the work of his hands? Well, Israel. Well, look here. It says it's Assyria. You see what I'm saying? It's a powerful, powerful passage, and it's a whole thing. And they have a lot of videos on it because they know it's a problematic passage for their belief. And this has been brought up to them, and their videos on it are just horrible. If you're mildly objective and you watch it, you're like, they're clearly not explaining the passage. They're just reiterating their cultic beliefs, just saying this just all means Israelites. You're not explaining the passage at all when you do that. You're not paying attention to the context. You're not paying attention to the grammar. You're not paying attention to the whole book of Isaiah. You're just not paying attention, because all you got blinders on. But go ahead, bro.
No, that's really good. And I think so. Well, there's several hermeneutics books back there. I'm creating a course that people can get specifically to address the root of this issue, which is poor or horrible or non-existent hermeneutics. Just seeing a word and saying, oh, this fits what I believe, what I want to say, and just running with that. And even in light of being shown otherwise by scholars and other people, you double down on it. That says more about, like you said, the veil over their heart, that this isn't about head knowledge. It's about heart knowledge. and we just play a piece in that discussion on behalf of God. And so thankful to be able to do that. And just so we're clear too, because this covers a broad range of cults. The Bible in 0 places is specifically prophetic about the United States of America.
Oh yeah.
So everybody on the interwebs, I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, I don't care nothing in the Bible is specifically prophetic about this territory we know as the United States of America. Let's be done with that.
This is true. I mean,
Deuteronomy 28 cannot fit anyone's paradigm in America because it has nothing to do with America. So,
yeah, and I mean, people that assume America's in there, they don't do so really on any kind of exegetical basis.
No.
They'll say things like, well, don't you think the Bible would mention the world's most powerful empire? Or they'll say something like that. I'm like, bro, first of all, like, that's how you think about America? I'm not so sure. Like, think about how long Rome was around and how much territory Rome controlled using ancient.
This country's a baby.
Young or England, its heyday. And that's why actually some of the British Israelites would kind of they would like look to passages and be like, oh, look, we fulfill this or fulfill that. But that's neither here nor there. You think about that and you say, well, that's not a rationale. That's not an exegetical basis. That's like a limited temporal observation. You're saying, well, don't you think that God would? And, this happens with hyper dispensationalists too, where they see America and they tell you it's here, it's there. And it's like,
yep.
Well, you're telling me it is. And everybody wants to be in the Bible, right? Yeah. The Hebrews like to tell people on the street they're in the Bible, and Americans want to think they're in the Bible. So you got a bunch of people who want to be directly mentioned in the Bible in that explicit kind of way.
Right.
And meanwhile, poor ancient Israelites that are reading this, thinking it's about actual Babylon and not realizing this is about the United States of America thousands of years later.
Right.
Saying it somewhat facetiously, but no, America's not up in there. Specifically, you could talk about a worldly system or this or that. But no, it's not. It's just not, man.
It's just not. Sorry, y'all. Sorry to bust the bubble.